People can hear us. That is great. What is up, everyone? You're listening and watching IndiE3 2014. I'm Zolani Stewart. I wasn't here around today, but I am back. And I have a panel full of incredibly intelligent people. We're going to talk about capital. We're going to talk about capitalism, and I'm really, really excited to do that. I'm here with Austin Walker. I'm here with Ian Williams. I'm here with Iris Bull. Austin Howe is just hanging out and quiet, and he's gonna listen and have a good time. I'm here as well to moderate, but I also want to say some things as well. Thanks, Austin. And I want to actually say some things myself as well. So I'm also going to be sort of past speaking as well. This panel is about video games and their capitalism. Which I know is a pretty broad topic, but I want to make sure that we get to some particular things in certain. What I want to start with, and what I think is sort of worth starting around, is when I say something like video games are part of the capital system, right? So I say, okay, video games are part of capital, which is his own sort of loaded term and such. Like this is an interesting question. Like, what does it imply when I say something like that? What does it mean for video games as an industry, as a sort of cultural assemblage, to be under the capital system, to be part of capital and the capital system? What does that usually imply generally? If anyone can help me answer that.
Well, I think that maybe I'm not the right person to be because of what we were just talking about. But I think that by suggesting that games are part of capitalism, you're talking about how games are products, and then game making is a process, and both of those things get commodified and turned into goods that can be purchased and sold.
Yeah, totally, absolutely.
Yeah,
and that the systems of production are caught up in capitalistic systems. Not just that the output is products, but even that the output that isn't product, even games that go free online, they exist under a scope that is capitalistic in nature, right?
Exactly. So when we think of what capital is, particularly, we can think of capital not necessarily because what I wanted to do when we talk about video games under capitalism is make sure that to extend the conversation outside of money, outside of this idea of okay, well, people make money. It's more than just people wanting to make money, right? It's about people gaining particular capital, which means a lot of things, right? That particular thing. It's this idea also, and this is something that other people like to assert, which is that what makes capital particular. Right, than different kinds of world systems, like feudalism and other kinds of old ancient systems, particularly is how capital in itself is self-justifying. In capitalism, particularly in this system, the capitalist makes capital for its own sake. Right, I buy labor power and then I use labor power to make capital. And I do this to make more capital, and this is this is endless accumulation. This is the sort of process, the endless accumulation of capital. The fact that different capitalists set out to accumulate capital endlessly. In itself, it creates a system that is somewhat contradictory. This is what people like to assert. So it's this understanding of accumulation, and what makes it particular is a sense of repetition about it. The self-justifying nature of it. This is the idea that I do this thing for its own sake. There is no end to it, and that means everything else is secondary, which means that the thing I create is particularly secondary. And I think there's something separate.
I'm separated from it, right? Like that. There are a bunch of things in play that not only make the accumulation of capital the end goal of production, but also in the process of doing that, there are mechanisms in place to separate as a laborer from the thing I'm producing, and as a consumer to understand things as products and not as some other category of thing, right?
Also, as what's it called? As production systems become a little bit more complicated, what we see is that we start to see sort of sectioning offs at different sorts of productions in different places, which I think is also something that's actually worth mentioning, particularly. I want to start by talking a little bit when we think about labor. I want to talk about work a little bit, and this is something we can talk about work a little bit because labor is usually like the first place people go over there, and I figured it probably makes more sense to start over there first. I figured it makes more sense. What I'm particularly interested is this idea. There's a theorist. His name was Mark Fisher, and he once wrote about the kind of labor we could think of in the 20th century, and he called it Fordist labor. All right, so this idea that I work in a factory. All right, I work in like a car factory in Detroit or something in the 50s, something like that, right? And a car comes and I do this part of the car, it goes down the conveyor belt. Someone else does this part of the car, it goes on the conveyor belt, and I'm doing this kind of old sort of factory labor, particularly. I can do this factory job. I do this factory job for a long time, maybe I do it for my whole life, right? Particularly, right? So I do it for a while. And it's not particularly fun to do. It's really worrying, and the hours are pretty long with it. But when I get out, I'm not working. So the split between my life and my work are very, very distinct here, right? And when I'm at work, hey, I'm there, but when I'm gone, I don't have to worry about it anymore. Particularly, and this is what he called particularly forced labor. But then when you move into, and then he what he does is that he observes that when we start to move past 1980 or so, and then we think of like a dot-com boom, and then we start to move into booms of technology. We start to do this idea of creative labor, and then what happens is we start to realize that there are sectors of working, of high-tech working, that aren't actually as stable, where the difference between life and work actually starts to get muddled a lot. What part is my working part? What part of my life is working? What part of my life is actually just my own life? What part is separated? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we sort of see these things are actually pretty precarious, right? I'm not sitting there working one job for the rest of my life. I'm working multiple jobs all the time, going back and forth, and this becomes a requirement. This idea that I have to shift between different things very quickly, that I have to be constantly flexible, that I am never stable.
It's not just that you are hustling. It's not just like, oh, I'm going to moonlight and get a second job because I want to accumulate more. It's the baseline is only achievable through flexibility, through an increased work schedule, through incorporating more labor into your everyday life. And the other thing I do just want to say really quick before we move on is,
absolutely,
of course, there has always labor that is done outside of what we traditionally consider workplaces. That labor is often gendered. That is reproductive labor that historically was done by women and was disregarded and not considered labor. So one way to think about it is, in post-Fordism, there is more sorts of creative and reproductive labor happening in our daily lives. And the other way is just to make sure that we don't say that there was never that thing happening is really important. But I know that Iris wanted to talk a little bit about gendered labor in gaming and gender in gaming in general. And I think that that's a background thing that we should always keep in mind, is that reproductive labor was a real thing and still is a real thing that has a gendered history.
Yeah, because I think that when we talk about labor, we're often talking about these processes that are always kind of like you were saying before, done just for the sake of doing them, but really when you tie them back down to the body, it's all about surviving. And within these social spaces that we call home or work, there's only participating in the capitalist production of goods and services in order to survive, which is to eat and to then raise families and to reproduce oneself. And in some sense, I think that it's almost like a different. It's not a different matrix necessarily, but it's a reflection of who's kind of more in control of talking about capitalism in the kinds of valued goods and services, when we then start to talk about reproductive labor as valued labor, right? Because people were almost always making money off of baby making, but then the child rearing and all of that other valued form or undervalued forms of labor that have then brought about kids and stuff, that's always never really been something that exists within the capital system, because the people running the show don't know how to commodify that. I guess when I think about games and labor in terms of capitalism, I'm kind of always drawn back to this thinking that video game makers are always in this feminine and kind of not feminine, but feminized, vulnerable position. And so when we talk about games under capitalism, it's really games and then indie games, and those are the kind of gendered relationships that you can kind of find that are always hierarchically structured, right? You have games and then indie games, and that kind of categorization that separates them then allows someone to draw kind of valued relationships between whether one is better than the other.
Yeah.
Right.
So
this is why you end up having conversations where indie games, you end up hearing, even from people inside of that space, talking about in the labor of making indie games as being something that is like done for passion. Like, oh,
Right.
we're doing this for the love of it. In the same way that a mother takes care of her family because she loves them. Like, nah, dog, this is still a labor conversation, right? And that's an important thing. I know that Ian just wrote a piece. I want to be clear too. I don't think that there is. My question to Ian, I guess, is: do you also see that conversation, the like, do it for the love of the thing, in the mainstream, the AAA space? I know Ian just wrote a really big piece on CCP Atlanta, who shut down. They were working on that World of Darkness game. Ian, is that only an indie game thing, or do you find that division of kind of real, quote, real labor and then undervalued labor even in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, my first, it was actually my second Jacobin piece is called "You Can Sleep Here All Night." You can look it up, and it's really explicitly about that. I worked 2.5 years in the industry, and I worked at a company that was actually fairly. It was AAA. It treated its employees fairly well and everything like that. But there was a sense that even though your crunch time wasn't that bad there, and even though we were paid fairly well and everything like that, even in the AAA space, no matter where on the spectrum you fall, I don't care if it's at one of the, I don't care if it's at Blizzard or Valve or one of the, those gold standard studios, there's still a sense that you're doing it for passion, because you don't go into video games, even if you're, the most left brain programmer there is, you don't get into it because of anything other than you want to make video games.
Right.
And going back to the gendered thing, I tend to think of most creative work, like Iris was saying, tends to fall in this kind of like a gendered area. It's talked about in gendered fashion. It's kind of devalued in a sense. You can see this with writers. There's like a big push where people are saying, look, don't work for free. If they're telling you to work for free, to work for exposure, that's complete nonsense. Don't do that. And they would never, ever, ever do that with a traditional.
If you're going to make bells in the factory,
right,
you're going to collect a paycheck.
Somebody would tell you that, and you would say, that's no, I would never do that. Why are you disrespecting me that way? But and I think that it's extremely conscious on the part of the industry, right? Like I don't want to say that it's conscious in the sense that there's like this cabal of evil studio heads who get around
twirling their mustaches.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
It's nothing
Whiplash.
like that.
Yeah.
But it's kind of got this own logic to it. And referring back to my Jacobin piece, and I probably want to revisit the Guardian thing that I wrote about CCP soon. But going back to the initial Jacobin piece, where I kind of lay out everything that's like the industry as a whole and its relationship with labor. There's this very neat progression that you can see, right? And it goes from like the for-profit schools who have the commercials late night, and they're like, play video games for a living, and your mom won't believe that you get paid for this, right? The commercials, which is just a very it's preying on this notion that it's kind of this glamorous passionate job where you get to do the thing that you love for a living.
Right.
And there was this just to illustrate, once you go to the studios, there's this constant churn. A friend of mine and I used to call it the Hollywood waiter effect, because we would know people who would move from North Carolina, where I'm at, and, we've got an okay industry, but they would move from like North Carolina to, Austin or Montreal or out to Orange County or something like that. They didn't have a job lined up, right? They would just take whatever was there, and, in the hopes that they would break big in the industry, not as, just kind of waiting for their chance. And it was like more than one person. And I saw a tweet. It was from a fellow who works at Pixar. I think I retweeted it, but he went to a video game studio in LA, and I'm going to get this back to India in a second, but and turn it back to you guys. But this studio head at LA said that he wanted 15% turnover because at all times, because the younger workers that they could get in other words, the ones who didn't realize that the line about passion doesn't make up for not making as much, and it doesn't make up for not seeing your family. They wanted those young, hungry workers who still bought that line, right? And like this guy is 100% cognizant of what he's doing, right? Like he knows how the assembly, like how that human assembly line works, and the entire industry, whether it varies in like how aware individuals are of it that are partaking in it, but it's extremely there at all levels.
Yeah.
So
Can I just add on to that really quick, or jump off of
totally.
that?
That's
If
fine,
that's
that's
okay,
fine.
unless you want to transition. So for me, the thing that calls to mind, that kind of like the young waiter who moves out to LA to break it in Hollywood, but can't, but doesn't have any jobs lined up, and just kind of like hopes that they make it eventually. Today that person might start starring in independent web series for free, right? They get paid by bagels by someone like Felicia Day until she makes it, right? Or they become an independent small film maker themselves, and they take out loans, and they suddenly are $50,000 in debt. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. One, because I'm doing this other research on TV production and film production that isn't like my passion, but is a thing I'm doing to pay the bill. But what I've noticed there, what we've kind of found out there, is the big media companies, the TV companies and the film companies, have begun seeing how they can make that independent labor, that what we might call hope labor, do work for them. Even if it's, one, by co-opting the production for a cheaper fee, but two, that it might just do work for them by existing. And so that's kind of part of what my question is about indie games, and the limitations that we make when we say what is indie. How, in what ways is indie a productive thing for AAA? And when we say indie, do we mean Hello Games, the 10 or 12 people who are represented on the Sony PlayStation stage? Do we mean Rodina, the indie space sim sort of like No Man's Sky that might have a Twitter presence or a Reddit presence? Do we mean the indie games that make it onto Steam through going through the Steam Greenlight? Do we mean the games that don't even need to go on Steam Greenlight because they happen to know someone at Valve, or they have an existing relationship, but they're still what we might traditionally call indie? Do we mean a game like Data Jack, which has no social media presence and yet still makes a bit of a splash to something like Desora? And trying to think through all of this, what I've kind of realized is, or kind of the position I kind of want to take right now is, one, indie isn't the most productive axis by which we can currently judge the economic context of game production. It's a limited one because it breaks up under closer inspection. And then two, Sony wants indie games. Sony loves indie games. Microsoft loves indie games. Steam loves indie games because they fill their platforms with content in between big releases. And having an install base makes their platforms really attractive for big publishers. So if you're Ubisoft and you see that Sony has courted 50 indie games to fill their platform over the year, you know that that's going to increase the buy-in. It's going to increase how many people own that platform. And so I'm kind of challenging the notion that it's indie versus AAA, or to say, let's be careful before we think it comes down to indie versus AAA, and instead say, how does AAA rely on hope labor? How does AAA rely on what Ian was just talking about, the person who is willing to risk it all because it's their passion project?
What's it called? I could say a few things on that. One thing I wanted to note before, actually, which actually probably be useful now, is that, and I'm pretty much kind of repeating what Iris said, but at least want to sort of solidify the notion that this is a I'm pretty sure that this is particularly an very important feature of the world system, right? Which is what is valued as labor and what isn't, right? Children do labor. Children do actually lots of labor that is incredibly valued, and I don't mean actual like working in a factory or something. I mean the fact that what is characterized and what isn't characterized as labor is actually really important, because we gain from a lot of labor that isn't particularly valued. And you're right that there is this weird shift between what is and what isn't valued as proper labor, particularly when it comes to indie. Like, I mean what's it called? I guess this is why the thing with that is that we start with, okay, well maybe indie versus AAA isn't particularly useful, right? But then it's just like, and then but then suddenly the second statement is, okay, well maybe the better question would be, okay, well how does AAA gain from it? But perhaps maybe it's better to even to sort of to push both those things particularly aside. Usually what I try to ask myself is an understanding of, well, who gains from what?
Right.
Generally, right, and who gains from the processes around, who gains from what particular ideas become popular, what ideas of what becomes a good model, for example, or their best kind of platform to go on, or something like that, right? So in that sense, it becomes a question of ideology, particularly, right? When it comes to that, so I mean, when it comes to this, like I guess my thing with that is that I guess is mostly what I'd say with it.
Well, let's see here. If you guys know Brendan Keogh?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So he wrote this really, really good piece when Irrational shut down called Video Games by Humans, or Games by Humans. And it was about how Ken Levine just basically summarily laid off 150 people, wandered off, and went off to his next project, and everybody was talking about what his next project was going to be, right? So in general, I don't think that video game workers are valued as labor in the sense that it's, that it's important and it's worth talking about. You can see this by the fact that the layoff rate in the video game industry is twice the national average across all industries. If this figure were in anything else, if this were like the airline industry or something like that, it would be on the news constantly, right? And video games are big business. It's not like this is like some niche business or anything like that anymore. This is like, butting up against Hollywood numbers, right? So it's something that should be talked about, and the fact that people don't talk about is your first tip off, right? But people do kind of value this romantic notion of the garage developer, that it's all really one man's work, and it's always man, right? It's Ken Levine, or it's, we're talking about Mark Jacobs or Brad McQuaid or whoever it was that, is on the way out there. So it's kind of this weird thing where the work of the many is just not valued, but because the idea of the video game, artist, the cult of the auteur is there, then they can kind of, they value that one individual's labor, right? So it's kind of a weird thing that shouldn't exist. And as I'm doing more, particularly with the piece on CCP Atlanta that I wrote, I think that perhaps the most damaging thing, the thing that's kind of holding back real discussions on a broader sense of where the industry's at, how it treats its workers, and where indie workers can go, right? Because indie workers kind of tap into that, right? Because it's usually like 1-2 people shops, kind of doing their own thing, and what I worry about with indie games is that it doesn't break that paradigm, because I think that paradigm of the garage developer, the Will Wright syndrome, is that I'm really starting to think that is one of the roots of the problems standing in the way of like really changing the industry on a broader sense,
broad level.
Yeah, we need to like shake ourselves out of this sense that it's 1-2 people doing the work, right?
With what are basically an abstraction of labor that is 8 Ubisoft studios, right? Like that it's hundreds and hundreds of people who you don't talk about, or you only understand as in a very abstract way, in that, it's just X number of work hours until the game is complete, and we have X or Y number of workers, putting those hours in. But like, we don't even talk about that. Labor is completely abstracted from what's actually happening, and the actual individual laborer isn't valued. It's just anyone can be plugged into that space, especially given the high turnover rate that you talked about, and we're happy. We as consumers are happy. Those of us in managerial positions are happy. It's not an individual animator we care about. It's an animator. All we need is an animator to make those animations, right? And that separates us from being able to be critical about individual labor conditions. Sorry, Iris.
Yeah, no, I think that's all very important to say, and I'm kind of sitting over here and I'm thinking about the ways in which people kind of like are co-opted into co-producing capitalism as a system, and for me, it's like when we talk about like who's actually doing the labor, we're asking, how and where are bodies situated within the production of capitalism, and when we then tell stories, we're kind of mapping this geography that is, I think, it's like this code that intends to distract us from kind of the more complex relationships that are going on. So when we abstract the production system of a game to these kind of very rudimentary relationships, like, oh, it's so and so's game, and so many people have been laid off. It's kind of working to I guess I'm kind of wondering, like, how if we can talk about how all of that's crap, you know, and sorry, in some sense, like how these kind of representative stories about who's doing the work.
Right. BG News in the chat says Ken Levine wanders into the desert and emerges months later, haggard, clutching Bioshock Infinite to the tattered rags of his clothes. Like, that's exactly the story that you're saying is told to us over and over again.
Yeah.
How do we intervene and you know, destabilize that story?
Yeah, right. Because it seems like the center, right, the supposed center is always around what the product is, who made the product, and where it's being distributed to, right? And in some sense, that seems to be this kind of part of the kind of recursive logic of capitalism, is to focus it, like, to kind of narrow all of this work into this one fine point, and then to move on, right, to the next product. Because when I think about capitalism, I really do think that it's like this multi-dimensional organism that, you know, that has actual geography. It is an actual space. It has actual bodies, and, you know, it's not just machinic. It's not machinic because it's able to mutate in you know, within under particular circumstances. I think that's really important to keep in mind. But then also the language that we use to reproduce capitalism. You know, I think we should really be maybe more cognizant of you know, to the way in which when we critique games, for example, we say, oh, this is good or this is bad, or when we try to universalize things, all of that is also within the product, like the process of co-producing capitalism. So we're assigning value in a way that is always situated onto a product or process, or a body even.
Right, well, and that comes down to questions of consumption at the end of the day, right? Like, so much of our evaluation of games treats them first and foremost as products. We kind of talked about this yesterday on a different panel, Zolani, but during the dev criticism panel, we kind of said there needs to be more criticism that doesn't just treat the final product as or the final, you know, product of labor as a consumptive product, as a product that, you know, the only evaluative concern is this a thing that someone should spend their money on? Is this a thing that made the company its money back, right? Like, these are the questions that come up so often in a lot of the mainstream conversation around games. And it's hard to break out of that, even in alternative criticism spaces. It's hard to leave what Irish has talked about, which was this is good, this is bad, sort of, am I spending my money wisely evaluation? In that sense, what this is the idea that there is a style of criticism. I usually call it review culture because it's usually the most accurate way to say I'll call it, which is focused heavily on evaluation, right? This is the idea that we assign value even with hard metrics as well, right? Absolutely, but I want to make sure that we don't make that clean division where it's only review culture. I do think it happens inside of our current criticism culture. Like, I think it happens in my own writing when I write about games, and I struggle with it constantly. That even though I think of myself as not writing what we would call a game review, like, even when I'm doing an in-depth piece on Bioshock Infinite last year or something, right? Like, am I at the end of the day making an evaluation about the thing as a product and not something else? And I know, Zolani, you've actually gotten to this point before fairly recently on Twitter. You talked a lot about how one thing that you are thinking about doing more of is critique of games that, even if you recognize them as holistic, you know, objects, that dives deep on a specific, you know, aspect of a game, that says, I'm going to focus on this one element. And part of the effect of that, I think, and I kind of thought this when I read those tweets, was like, hey, maybe that's one way to treat these things as something other than whole products ready for consumption. It's actually kind of interesting. I mean, I never thought of. I'm not actually particularly sure what tweets you're referring to, but when I can think about it, I mean, like, I never thought too much about approaching it as a sort of this idea of being incredibly granular. Although when I do criticism, I do try to be incredibly specific to what I'm talking about. So Iris has noticed this idea of abstraction, and we notice that abstraction isn't just something of how we are told of how labor works, right? Is that we're given particular narratives
about how labor functions in order to obscure labor in a sense, right? And this idea, but also this happens in how we critique games and look at games. And I've talked a lot before about how our language, how we describe games, is also one that can also be sort of fall into those logics, and I think it lies also in being incredibly abstracted about things. You know, I used to complain a lot about how I never liked the word gameplay particularly and such like that. But what this is the idea that we have these very abstracted rubrics of how games work, right? And that the language that we talk about games shapes how we conceptualize how games work, right? And what is a good game, what is a bad game, and what we start to realize is that what it does is that it pedestals certain games and pushes other certain games down. And what we start to find out is that the way that we conceptualize games tends to pedestal a very particular type of game, a very specific type of video game, a lot of more traditional particular games, and other games that are somewhat radical in a sense, other games that kind of stray particular structures, maybe are somewhat experimental in a sense, usually actually don't get very notified. And this actually comes in the idea of what is a game, right? Which is like a weird, which is like a really like, which isn't, I mean, for a lot of people, this isn't really too much of an important question. But when we think about what does and what doesn't get touted as this, we can come back to this idea of gendered labor. Mm-hmm. Right, so is understanding that those who aren't particularly programmers, so they use something like Twine or maybe Construct or something, and they make like a little text adventure that this particularly doesn't match the video game, right?
Or even things like what's the not Gone Home, also Gone Home, but Proteus. Proteus also.
Dear Esther?
Yeah, Dear Esther is the one that I was thinking of. Exactly. Like, oh, that's the walking simulator, #walking simulator, right?
Yeah. So I mean, from a labor perspective, particularly, we can think of stuff like Twine and sort of small tools, right? And then we can go back to, okay, well, what's the opposite of that? Well, it's the hundreds of people working on a thing, particularly that looks very expensive, right? So this thing is particularly justified by lots of capital, and therefore it is legitimate, right? So when we think about capitalism as a system that creates, that does that, it separates what labor is valued, what isn't valued, particularly, right? And this understanding of also what is legitimate, what isn't legitimate. So there's understanding of, on a labor level, but also on a cultural level, the cultural laws of capital saying, well, this isn't particularly legitimate because it doesn't pedestal, it doesn't reproduce capital in particular in the same way. But when we think about it in the terms of something like Proteus or Dear Esther, right? This becomes a little harder because this is a more of a, at least I like to think of it as more as idea of, well, what does this game contain that's different that makes it not legitimate, and then what is it about this that is very different from the game where I sit there and I get the points and I do the levels and then do all that kind of stuff, but that game's incredibly legitimate as a game, and what's the differences between those? But then when we think about, okay, well what are each of these games' relationships to capital, to the logics of capital, right? Because I usually think of this on a cultural level, right? Of what game culture wants in their games, right? And games culture's relationship to logics of capital as well. That's a weird question, and it's hard for me particularly to figure that out. But this idea is that there is a difference between the two and how people approach them.
Well, and that's that notion of like recursion. I think that the relationship then between what gets to be a game, both ideologically and more tangibly, in some sense of like the digital world, like what can be simulated. I think it's important to keep in mind the ways in which our culture then shapes the way in which programming languages get written, and the programming architectures, right? So it was just banging my head on my thesis for the last 6 months, so please, humor me here. But in some sense, like when we talk about simulating a world in which we draw these very particular relationships that aren't, that are kind of more one-to-one or vertically hierarchical, that we're also producing conditions in which, culture within games reproduces capitalism, so that it's not hard to build economies with games that are inherently around a capitalist kind of economy. Mm-hmm. So I feel like in terms of like culture is being articulated on multiple levels and multiple dimensions, and then there's just like this constant feedback loop. And so, it's not that it's cyclical. I feel like it's more like like the infinite shape. Like there's that point of infinity where like you're always coming back to this one point and then immediately breaking away from it.
There's this was talked about at really well by Daniel Joseph at Daniel_Joseph on Twitter, I think.
Shout out to Danjo.
Yes, always shout out to Danjo. Danjo's like dragging me into like being a real person. It's great. Like forcing myself to get out there. He's great. But he, in a response to Stephen Byrne and my piece on his piece, Stephen Byrne's piece, and then my piece on leveling as a quote capitalistic mechanic, Danjo kind of asked this question, which is what is the role that games play in the reproduction of capital? I know someone was asking the same thing in the chat earlier. This is a really broad question. This is a question about how cultural artifacts reinscribe or don't. And Danjo, as always, kind of goes back to Stuart Hall and this kind of notion that something can be encoded into an artistic artifact, into any sort of media artifact, and that encoding does not necessarily always come out the other end, isn't received, isn't decoded in a one-to-one way, and so there's always some hope for rupture and some hope for resistance and breaking off there, but that for the majority of the cases, when the machine is functioning correctly and is being manned well and is being, and I say manned on purpose there, it can in fact encode the dominant ideology, right? Like, again, read that piece. It was excellent and does take a specific look at, it does build off of specific looks at leveling as a mechanic, which I think that specificity really helps.
Yeah, I just because I forgot what I was gonna say earlier, and then I just remembered because you just said the right thing, which is machine, right?
Well,
which is
Iris was talking about how it isn't necessarily machinic, and I do get that, and I think I agree. But I also think that the system that exists does also contain, like, I guess this could just be a difference of how we understand the word machinic or machines, which is to say, I often think machines do fail and do not reproduce themselves accurately, right?
Exactly.
Which is what we kind of agree upon.
What's it called? When I just wanted to know, because I know that Iris was noting the sort of the way that we approach things, we conceptualize things as machinic, and then I remembered, that's what I wanted to talk about. What I wanted to mention before was this idea that we think of capitalism on a cultural level of capitalism moves on from things, right? So when I was talking about Fordism before, I talked about this idea of well, this isn't the way things work now. Well, it actually is. It's just in other countries, right? This particular kinds of like factory labor,
right? Post-Fordism doesn't erase Fordism.
Exactly. So it's this understanding that capitalism becomes something that expands a lot, and Iris is right that it mutates. It's such like gross imagery, but it kind of makes sense.
No, it's perfect. It's great.
And in a sense that it's not something that moves on from one thing to other, rather it expands. And this of course matches the understanding that capitalism is something that commodifies the parts of our lives, right? That every part of our life ends up becoming commoditized and used into the endless accumulation of capital for its own weird sake.
Right. One of those really interesting mutations is something that someone in the chat pointed out, which is the kind of rise of crowdfunding. And in a related note to that, crowdsourcing. I think it was Escape Cage, and there's two ways to talk about this. One has already kind of been covered in the chat. Escape Cage says, Kickstarter might be a way to force a developer not to be an auteur, since angry supporters will not continue wasting money on someone who refuses to provide good products. And the first way to kind of talk about that the chat has talked about is kind of said, well, Kickstarter is super problematic for a bunch of other reasons. But the second thing, and I kind of want to pose Ian this question, which is that statement kind of says that auteur, like the kind of implicit statement there is that auteurs can drop the ball and be blamed for it. And based on Ian's writing, it kind of feels like right now when the ball gets dropped, it's the auteurs who are safe. It's management that is safe, and Absolutely. The laborers pay the cost. Is that accurate, Ian? Well,
you've got this other level of like the kind of culture of creative respect for those people, right? Mm-hmm. Like Steven Spielberg can make a bomb. Right. And Steven Spielberg is untouchable. And I've got something coming out next week, hopefully, but it's kind of a follow-up to that piece about CCP Atlanta. What I want people to know that basically, so CCP Atlanta basically fell apart because the executive class and the product leaders, the project leaders, were basically untouchable, right? They had like dictatorial powers. They could say what they want. They could do what they want. 150 layoffs in a little over a year. Not a single executive has lost his job or her job. So they're very much insulated. And what I try to tell people is I am convinced, going back to my thing where I said that, I think that cult of the auteur is really part of the problem of, this is getting back into the labor end of things rather than theory kind of guys. I'm one of those marks in my bones, not in my mouth kind of guy. I'm terrible at theory. But getting back to that, what I want people to know is that every single studio, I think, when there is a rash of layoffs, it's always down to that auteur, right? It's just every single time. I defy anyone to find me an example of mass layoffs in the video game industry or a studio closing or anything like that and have it be the worker's fault.
Right. In other words, what you're saying is that the reason that layoffs have to happen, the reason that financials are bad this quarter or whatever, it isn't because the workers didn't bust their butts hard enough. It's because somewhere at the managerial level dropped a ball, wasn't on the project hard enough.
Right.
Their vision didn't line up with what their end product was or what the market was ready for or something like that.
Yeah, or just gross negligence, like just not having things together, and ideally, I could give you the radical answer, which is let's just get rid of the management class and let's have like horizontal structure in the company. Sure. That's not going to happen tomorrow. So really what I want is and Kotaku does remarkably good labor reporting, right? Like this is just true, despite everything else that they write and what people think of them and stuff like that. They're generally on the ball when it comes to layoffs. And but I don't want just Kotaku and me
Polygon every now and then, and
right?
Gamma.
I mean, look, I have nothing but a high school education. On paper, I'm an idiot. I should not be writing. I don't want to see Ian Williams writing, about CCP Atlanta layoffs, right? In The Guardian. I want to see that in PC Gamer. I want to see it in,
on GameSpot.
Yeah,
absolutely. On IGN.
Right. So this is an interesting particular question, which is that why is this something that we're going to say? This is what was so remarkable, Ian, about weeding your piece in Jacobin, because I'm like, this is in Jacobin. They put this in Jacobin, but they won't put this on something like a GameSpot or something like that.
Because most of it is most of the video games media is really like an industry organ. It's there to push the product, even if I think that. The actual pay for reviews thing, is probably overstated nowadays.
Right, but it doesn't need to be, right? Like that's not
right.
The entire instrument is right. The entire instrument is about deciding which of these products to buy at the end of the day, right? Like, and about getting those products in front of eyes. Whether or not someone gets a 5 out of 10 in the magazine or on the website, like it's still putting that product in front of new eyes.
And there's this huge story like this week. It just happened like 3 days ago. It turns out that ZeniMax Online was hiring short-term contract workers, I guess, to do CS and stuff like that. They were hiring
for
them in
ESO.
Ireland. For TISO. They were doing it in Ireland. And they've laid off like 300 of them in like the past month and a half. And these are really short-term contract workers, and they were calling them in according to the Irish paper. And this is an Irish local paper, right? This is an Irish town of maybe 50,000 people. And they're writing about 300 people being called in like kind of waves at 10:30 when their shift starts at 11 and just, sending them out the door. And that's nowhere. And it's completely inexplicable to me that video game, I kept seeing these comments, on the Guardian piece. They were saying, man, why am I not seeing this in, the video games media? And I don't have an answer for that other than it's just,
here's one reason, because there's not a union to send that press release out. Right? Like there's no one to say, that sends that letter to Polygon and GameSpot and IGN and every other industry, voice that says, "Hey, we're making noise about this."
If they did send it to them, would someone like Polygon run it?
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. So? Yeah, absolutely. I think that if Brian Crescente at Polygon got a press release from an actual organized group of laborers, not just from one person over here or one person over there, that represented the industry, absolutely they would run it. I think that's, I mean, this is still part of the conversation, which is one of the things that happens under capital is that capital negotiates and is willing to concede. And one of those concessions is to give labor a voice publicly. And again, this isn't about people twirling their mustaches. This isn't, Brian Crescente isn't like, well, if they've organized, it's just, this is a thing that happens automatically. When you get a thing across your desk that comes from the same way that I bet you if the Writers Guild of America sent Polygon a thing saying, we're upset about the way, or not the Writers Guild, the Actors Guild, let's say, sent in a thing saying, we're upset about the way voice actors are being treated, and we're going to make this one of our main concerns in upcoming negotiations. They might run that story too, right? Like, I think that there is a certain sort of credibility that comes with organizing.
Well, right, because within capitalism, you have either money or you have bodies, because every dollar is a body, right? And so making horizontal moves within capitalism, which doesn't actually threaten capitalism, but kind of provokes it to kind of mutate so that it recognizes different power structures, is that creating labor unions. Labor unions are not going to end capitalism.
No, of course not.
They're just going to play within the vertical hierarchical system, right? And say, well, we are a bigger person because we are hundreds or thousands of people. So you have to pay attention to it. Right. So I think that was totally on point.
The other thing,
I think it's something worth noting too, as well, is as we've seen sort of decades go on, that there is a growing sort of skepticism towards unions. So this particular thing, this idea that what we understand is that and this is something that other people like to assert. I'm gonna talk about a writer named Wallerstein who I've been reading recently. It's some really really good stuff. And one of the things that he noted that I thought was so interesting was that you get these. Is that in the late 20th century, you get these what he calls these anti-systemic movements. So these sort of movements that want to sort of overpower. What happens is that they sort of become absorbed into these logics, right? This idea that anti-systemic wants to take over the state, right? So this is the idea that if we have the state becomes kind of like the boat steering wheel of politics in a sense. If I have power of the state, then I can put this wherever I want. Not realizing that the state is also a very important part of that world system. So when you take over the state, what happens is that you realize the anti-systemic groups realize, right, is that you actually can't make as much change as you want to. Particularly because you still have to operate within these sort of logics, and I feel like the same thing would probably happen to us unions for a while, where unions at a certain point. I mean, like where unions at a certain point, can only really do much with sort of negotiation, but still have to operate under certain kinds of rules.
But this is the war position, war maneuver conversation, right? Where we shouldn't see that unions can't overthrow the system and then say, well, screw it, we're going to go to something more drastic immediately, right? There are thousands of workers right now whose lives would be dramatically improved by having some sort of organization actually representing them, not just what's there now, which is representing them kind of in name, but not really. It's kind of a managerial thing. So yeah.
Well, which I think gets to one of the problems with representation is that you're always necessarily this abstract body that doesn't represent any one person, and so in some sense there's got to be some kind of rethinking about, well, what does representation mean, and how is that something like it gets to this notion of what is a constitution and how does constitution then run organization? So it couldn't ever just be people in a room talking about what they think is the best thing. No, they would have to be held to a kind of constitution that everyone was kind of on board with, and not to say that there would then be this propagation of laws and all of these other systems to interpret the constitution, but speaks to the larger problem with kind of representative politics.
Exactly, and possibly speaks to the problems with electoral politics as well, which I think is also an interesting topic we don't have time with. But yeah, well, one of the things I want to note also, just very quickly, is just that to represent is also just to abstract in a particular sense, which I think is sort of worth noting, is when we think about of what gets obscured when we think about these things, what gets kind of erased, and sometimes sometimes you just have to kind of erase some stuff if you want to conceptualize anything, right? And those are those problems, and I think that's worth thinking about when thinking of representative anything in the most part, which is that you take one person, and then you replace that one person with tons of people who probably have different ways of thinking over things, but sometimes it's actually necessary. So there's always this really weird sort of clench your teeth kind of logical and practical and material kind of negotiations that have to be made, difficult ones.
Yeah, I will say too, just to like tie this to my other pet project right now, which is, we're talking about labor, the labor of workers in AAA. We're talking about the labor of workers in what we're calling indie, but there is a third labor in gaming, and that is the labor of players and modders and fans.
Yes, absolutely.
And this is like a super concern for me right now, as more and more major companies introduce strategies to take advantage of that. Actually not major companies, a broad range of companies, ranging from Epic, whose new Unreal edition, the new edition of their Unreal Engine, Unreal Engine 4, is from the ground up taking a cue from Unity and saying, okay, we're gonna help, everyone's gonna build this from the ground up. This is especially seen in Unreal Tournament 4, which from the jump is a game being made through modder labor. But it's also seen at the smaller level. I love Starbound. Starbound was one of my favorite games last year. I am distressed over the way that team and some people on that team understand the importance of compensation to mod labor. If you dig through the Reddit, the Starbound Reddit, if you dig through the Starbound forums, you'll see that there has been, at least one major time where a deal with incorporating a mod directly into the game fell apart because the modder wasn't happy with the conditions they were given. This is the thing I talked about recently at the Canadian Game Studies Association conference, and the way that it worked was the modder made his mod. It was like an ammo mod, more ammo for all the guns, more weird. This is fire ammo, this is bouncy ammo, or whatever. Video games, and he, that his content was going to be put into the game directly, which is what we're doing with all of these mods, not all of them, but a number of them, and he was going to lose legal ownership over it. He was going to be allowed to continue to make his own separate mod, but they would take complete ownership of it going forward, and he wouldn't be paid. And this is what's happened for dozens and dozens of mods. And they're making it more easy. They're making it, they're researching ways in which, instead of having a long contract, it's a checkbox that you check when you submit your mod, right? And this is a big deal for me, because as hard as it's going to be to organize labor in the workplace, it's going to be that much harder to organize a huge group of modders decentralized across continents. And because it plays completely into the stuff that we started off talking about, which is this gendered idea of, creative passions. Oh, I'm a fan who's making this mod for free because I love Starbound, because I love Skyrim, because I love Unreal Tournament. And it's going to be that much harder to organize people, because from the jump, that labor isn't considered labor in any way. Not only is it not considered passionate labor.
I want to know particularly that we're gonna end this around 8:10.
Okay, great.
So if any, what does anyone want to particularly go over? Because Austin was talking about what counts, because like there's mod labor, and we can go over like when we play games.
Oh, absolutely.
Work playing games. Okay, yeah. Well, that's what I was working on, because Austin, we talked about this before. We went back and forth about this you were in the chat. On when I was talking with Austin and Stefan before,
yeah.
And you said that you were sympathetic to my opinions, but you were more down with Stefan, particularly with what was said there. It was basically this idea that I was very, very I'm very skeptical towards, and I'm going to say this probably in the last panel that we have on Nor's possibility with Zoya. He's going to be great. Is I'm very skeptical towards agency. This is something Alana said as well, which is I'm very skeptical towards agency. I'm skeptical towards the sort of direction of games. Yeah, shout out to Alana, she's there. Okay, cool. I'm very skeptical towards the kinds of way that games have sort of dismissed the idea of linearity, which as a negative connotation. And
I'm with you on all that stuff.
Have gone through this kind of expansionism. Right, this idea that we want to put more things into things, and that's how this will increase. As some really interesting Japanese critics that we're going to talk about on the last panel have noted, this idea that simply because you can't do something in a game doesn't mean it makes you less free.
No, absolutely. I'm with you on all that stuff completely.
So when we think about, when we contextualize it that way, which is like what can I and can't I do, and then when we put it into the thing of working in games, this idea when we put in metrics down. Right, so this idea that I can collect something, I can do something, right, and then I'm coerced particularly into collecting items to get something back, right, and this idea that okay, well, the more things that I can collect here, the more content is here, the more time that is in here, particularly, and this probably makes the game better, right? But that's not particularly true, and I think that the logics that would say that this is that these things are true. are ones that are actually probably related to logic of capital. At least this is what the idea.
Yeah, I think that you're right when you say that those things are related to the logic of capital and that we should investigate them. But I want to make sure that what we don't do is say those are labor in the same way that, for instance, this is still saying that play can be labor, that the players of EVE Online who create the majority of what other players interact with inside of the systems of EVE Online, that is labor. Like, for me, I'm more interested in that EVE Online as a game desperately needs player activity in order for it to be a product that anyone would ever play for. Or the way in which player activity inside of a first-person shooter or inside of a Ubisoft game, where we know that these are two types of things that player activity is tracked very closely, creates data that then can be used to improve those products, where literally that activity produces value for another institution, for another entity. So on one hand, you have what you're saying, Zolani, which is that I think that you're saying that there are elements of play that can replicate the systems of labor. It's a very Adornian idea. I'm with that. I'm into that. But I'm also
Adorno.
Right. Shout out to Adorno. Shout out to Frankfurt School. I see you, Benjamin. What are you up to? Hit me up later. But on the other hand, there's also, and this is like another big thing, is let's look at the systems that literally take player activity and generate revenue from those things, or save revenue by not having to hire testers, save revenue by not having to do surveys, right? So that's when I push back against that a little bit. I just wanted to make sure that those two things don't collapse in on each other. They're obviously super related, and I want to have that division.
Well, absolutely, of course, because what you're talking about is something that's very material,
right?
In some senses, which I think is important. We have about 3 minutes left. I mean, is there any particular kind of concluding remarks that any of you want to make? Anything you want to really go over, like really, really quickly? Any last statements you want to make?
Well, yeah, I guess I think in terms of taking this conversation beyond what we've kind of been talking about, I think in terms of kind of grappling with capitalism, because I don't know that you can necessarily simulate like an anti-capitalism outside of a game. I don't know that really thinking outside of capitalism is really possible within games at this point. I think there's a huge ontological, like a way of thinking and organizing information, and then representing. I think all of that kind of needs to have some kind of a shift in order to kind of punch our way out of the paper bag, so to speak. And so one of the things I would like to kind of continue as a conversation just on Twitter with me is like, so how do we emulate something that isn't capitalism in a way that decenters survival ability, like our ability to survive as human beings, in a way that, but in a way that is still making this experience that's incredibly pleasurable and fulfilling to share with others.
Okay, that's a really good way to end.
Where can people find you on Twitter, Ira?
Oh, I'm at iBull. So just IBULL.
It is a crime that I'm not following iBull. I'm going to do that right now.
It is a crime.
iBull, like why wouldn't you just follow based on the name?
Yeah, why weren't you already following? Why didn't you sign up for Twitter?
I'm behind on things. I don't do the Twitter well, but I'm fixing that mistake right now. Geez, thank you all for speaking. Thank you all for participating.
Thank you for having us here. This was
thank
obviously
you.
This conversation needs to be way bigger, but I'm really happy we at least got like a glance.
Yep, me too.
At some really, really smart folks. And thank you for watching. Thank you very much for watching. We're going a little bit past the 10 because we start a little bit at the 10, so we're going to keep going at the 10 a little bit. It's just a thing. Right now we're going to switch out really quickly, and when we come back, I'm going to actually be on the next panel with Austin Howe and James Howard, and we're going to talk about critical approaches. So we're going to do that. We're going to be back right now. Thank you all for watching. Again, you're watching IndiE3 2014, and we'll be right back. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.